Thanks for joining us for this KSAT Explains live stream. I'm Myra Arthur. This is our first new episode of 2022, and tonight we're talking about an issue that has loomed large in the past few years, and one that will undoubtedly continue to be in the headlines in the run-up to the November elections. It's immigration, and more specifically, what it means to seek asylum here in the U.S. Take a look. Immigration is one of the biggest hot-button issues in our current political moment, and it's often named among the issues that voters care most about.
It does have a real effect on real people.
In the past few years, we've seen several instances where a surge in border apprehensions sparks new debate about who should be allowed into the United States and how to reform our immigration system.
At this point, there have never been more immigration cases pending.
But this topic is a complicated one, and in the eyes of immigration laws, not everyone who tries to enter the U.S. is the same. And the pandemic has further complicated things for those seeking safety in our country.
They were crossing in plain view, just trying to get here so they could make an asylum claim.
Based on our laws and international laws and norms, people have a right to seek asylum.
In this episode of KSAT Explains, we're breaking down the difference between how the U.S. handles asylum seekers and those who enter the country illegally and try to go undetected. Plus, we're also taking a look at a little-known provision in federal law that has upended the system.
KSAT Explains.
KSAT Explains. KSAT Explains.
KSAT Explains. On-demand, in-depth perspective. Perspective on stories we bring you in our newscasts throughout the day. We're looking into concerns over voting safety during the pandemic and the battle over mail-in voting. A look at how the protests and demonstrations have played out in our city, and an examination of what it means to be black in San Antonio.
An issue that you have likely felt the effects of, rising property taxes.
The roots of Tejano run deep in South Texas. We examine the cultural impact the music has had in San Antonio.
Team breaking down how a provision in federal law known as Title 42 has affected the United States' already complicated immigration system.
Thanks for joining us for this episode of KSAT Explains. I'm Myra Arthur. Just the mention of the word immigration can be divisive. Some people consider themselves for it or against it. Others see it as much more complex and nuanced than that. No matter where you stand on the issue of immigration, you know that it's impacted South Texas. Last fall, we saw thousands of Haitian migrants cross the Rio Grande into Del Rio looking for asylum. But then there are other examples of Border Patrol agents catching people going through the rugged South Texas brush, seemingly trying to stay undetected. So what's the difference? What does U.S. law allow when it comes to people looking for safe haven in this country versus those who are just trying to make it here? That's where we start.
You have to be physically present in the U.S. to make an asylum claim. So that is what our law requires.
Whether asking for asylum or not, crossing into the U.S. without proper documentation is still crossing the border illegally.
A person who is trying to come in and remain undetected would only attempt to do that by crossing through the river. An asylum seeker might present at a port of entry without paperwork and say, I need protection, I want to apply for asylum. Many asylum seekers also cross the river and essentially turn themselves in.
Which is what we saw play out in Del Rio in September 2021. Roughly 16,000 migrants, mostly from Haiti, crossing into the U.S. asking for asylum, fleeing a country in upheaval after the assassination of the Haitian president and a devastating earthquake. If someone is seeking asylum in the U.S., the first step is what's called a credible fear interview. That's when an asylum officer decides whether a person merits going through the full asylum process. Border Patrol is supposed to detain someone who gets referred for that interview.
Detention looks different if you're in a family unit or if you're just in an adult who's alone.
For those people not detained, often families, they're told to report to an immigration and customs office nearest to where they will be staying, often with friends and family who are already in the U.S.
Sometimes at that first reporting, people are placed either on an ankle monitor, or the agency is also now using some apps with cell phones that basically do the same thing, right? So that's a monitoring mechanism that is used to try and ensure that people don't, just kind of disappear.
But there are people who do, or try to. So what happens to those who ask for asylum but never follow through with that process, failing to show up for an interview or to see a judge?
Generally, what happens with those people is that ICE goes out looking for them. How much resources go into going after somebody who does that? Frankly, depends on the person, right? Do they have a criminal history? Are they someone that the agency is really concerned about? And, a person could get away with it for a week, or they could get away with it for years.
And there are those who come into the country illegally who have no intention of asking for asylum. If someone trying to remain in the U.S. undetected comes into contact with immigration authorities, they'd likely be deported. A person living in the U.S. illegally can seek asylum after they've been caught.
The DHS is currently kind of trying to deport you, so you can apply for asylum defensively, saying like, oh, I actually have a reason to stay in this country.
As far as the asylum application process, there are time frames in which those steps are supposed to be taken, but the immigration attorneys we talk to say that most of the time, those deadlines are not met. Farah Sabawi explains why.
Nobody is supposed to stay in CBP custody for more than 72 hours. We know that that's routinely violated.
If a migrant is referred for a credible fear interview,
It's supposed to happen within 7 days. That almost never happens.
once a person has their case before an immigration judge, there is no required timeline for when progress must be made in the case. The immigration court system was backlogged long before COVID, but the pandemic made the problem worse, with immigration court closures and postponed court hearings. All of that was sure to add to the backlog. But what was causing issues before March 2020? The attorneys we talked to believe it's a combination of things.
There's not enough judges, there's not enough resources in the system so that it can go faster and smoother.
In part, in 2014 and 2015, when there were large numbers of minors and families that started to come. I think the other part is just that the immigration court is part of a federal agency and it's slow to respond.
I think it's bureaucratic. The immigration system itself is the issue.
Sanchez also told us that the timeline changes depending on where a migrant chooses to wait out the asylum process.
If you do the whole process while you're detained, it takes a couple of months.
But if a migrant chooses to be released while waiting on their case to move forward, it could take years.
Many detention centers have their own court, so they have judges just for that detention center, whereas non-detained judges that do non-detained cases might be seeing asylum and 100 other things. So it could just take longer.
The pandemic didn't just add to a backlog of immigration cases. It also led to the authorization of a little-known provision in federal law that has essentially shut out migrants looking for asylum for the past 22 months. In March 2020, 10 days after the World Health Organization declared the novel coronavirus a global pandemic, then President Donald Trump invoked Title 42. The public health law allows the federal government to ban people or goods from entering the U.S. to prevent the spread of disease, in this case, COVID-19.
And so under that authority, a directive was issued essentially saying we are not going to process people who want to request asylum.
Instead, those seeking asylum or hoping to immigrate to the U.S. after entering from Mexico or Canada are fingerprinted and then expelled from the country. Important to note, though, that is not the same as deportation.
It doesn't carry the future consequences that people would have if they were deported at the border by an immigration judge.
When someone is deported, they are barred from re-entering the country for a certain number of years, depending on the reason for the deportation. Title 42 expulsions do not carry that consequence. But some argue that that doesn't mean there is no consequence for those who are expelled.
It does have a real effect on real people who have merit for wanting to apply for asylum, who have actually had something really bad happen to them, or they're fleeing, and them returning could mean that they die or somebody else dies.
So how many Title 42 expulsions have been carried out since March of 2020? More than 1 million. Take a look at these numbers. Between March 2020 and September 2021, 1.4 million people were forced to leave the U.S. under Title 42. That's out of 2.5 million people that CBP encountered crossing the southern border. All of this is happening as apprehensions along the U.S.-Mexico border reach a 20-year high over the last fiscal year. This graph here shows those apprehensions along the southwestern border over the last 8 years. The red line shows October of 2020 through September of 2021. That orange line, that same time period, but the year prior. You can see the migration numbers have been steadily growing since there was a lull in border crossings in April of 2020 due to the pandemic. But some of the immigration attorneys that we talked to for this episode say that these numbers can be a little misleading. These numbers track arrests, not individuals. According to a report put out by the American Immigration Council, many migrants are now trying to cross the border multiple times after failing, leading to a higher number of apprehensions, but not necessarily a higher number of people trying to get into the U.S. One of the reasons cited by that report is Title 42. The provision is creating a system in which migrants are rapidly processed at the border, then sent back to Mexico without a deportation order, making it easier for people to cross repeatedly. According to U.S. Customs and Border Protection, this influx in migrants is nothing new. It's part of a cycle that has fluctuated over the last 2 decades. That latest spike was in Del Rio last fall when we saw those roughly 16,000 migrants, mostly from Haiti, show up hoping to seek asylum. But as Lexi Salazar tells us, to the dismay of immigration rights advocates, many were expelled by the Biden administration using Title 42.
In May of 2021, citing increasing security concerns and social unrest in Haiti, the Biden administration granted temporary protected status for Haitians already in the U.S. This shielded them from deportation and allowed them to obtain work permits. But that status would not apply for those who arrived in Del Rio months later. The United States' decision to send thousands of those migrants back to Haiti or to Mexico was met with protests from the ACLU, immigration activists, and some immigration attorneys.
As an immigration attorney, I know these kind of flagrant violations of the rule of law shouldn't be happening here in the U.S. People should have their day in court. Due process is due to them.
When Title 42 is applied and people are sent back without any sort of screening, that is arguably a violation of our own law and also of the treaty obligations that the U.S. is party to by signing the Refugee Convention.
The Trump administration cited preventing the spread of COVID-19 as the reason for invoking Title 42. But critics have said that reason was not legitimate. Reports that have come out since March of 2020 seem to back up that criticism. Some CDC doctors believed that the bulk of evidence did not support using Title 42 as a public health measure, saying it would not slow the spread of COVID. After taking office, the Biden administration made an exemption to Title 42, halting the expulsion of unaccompanied children. But besides this exemption, the administration has largely continued to use and defend the provision. They are even facing a lawsuit from immigration activists, who are arguing that the government is using Title 42 as a law enforcement tool, not a public health tool. Oral arguments in that case are set to begin this month. In the meantime, Sanchez says that he's seeing migrants find other ways to enter the United States.
So entering without inspection, not at a border crossing or at a bridge, but to cross through a river or a desert, because they're not being allowed to present themselves to apply for asylum at the border. They take other means because they don't feel safe, they don't feel secure.
It's important to note that Title 42 is not the only controversial policy currently affecting migrants. The Migrant Protection Protocols, better known as the Remain in Mexico program, allows Homeland Security to send non-Mexican asylum seekers to Mexico while they await their hearings in U.S. immigration court. Remain in Mexico applies to migrants who, for whatever reason, are not expelled under Title 42 and are allowed to make an asylum claim. We'll continue to follow what's happening at our borders, as well as how Title 42 is being used and the litigation trying to fight it. I'm Myra Arthur. Thanks for joining us for this episode of KSAT Explains. We'll see you next time. Thanks for checking out this live stream of KSAT Explains. This is a streaming show where we take one topic and we explore it from a lot of different angles, giving it more context and more perspective. You can check out any past episode of KSAT Explains by going to ksat.com/explains. And while you're there, let us know what you want to see us cover. Do you have a question about an issue facing South Texas? Or is there just something you want to know more about, something you've seen in your neighborhood, or something that's been making headlines lately? You can submit your ideas in that prompt box you see right here on your screen. Again, that's at ksat.com/explains. We're glad you're with us tonight. I'm Myra Arthur. Go check out all those episodes. We'll see you next time.